Greetings. It's just about 11 a.m. in Atlanta, Georgia, and I would like to be the first one to welcome everybody on behalf of the MSI Cyber Consortium that has sponsored these series since April 2020. I think this is something like webinar number 55, but a very special one. As you will see in a few minutes, I will introduce some of our legendary colleagues in international business. I can't wait to do that, have this conversation with them. But let me just say a few things about our sponsors. We are a consortium of 10 cybers led by Georgia State University Cyber that have pivoted in April 2020 to this form of sharing insights, information, best practices, teaching, pedagogy among us, international business educators. In addition to teaching topics, we've also covered research topics, certainly, and we've had many occasions on, in terms of conversations with senior business leaders on their perspectives of the current business environment. But this one obviously is a very special one. These sessions are recorded, by the way, so you'll have a chance to review it later on and share the link with others. The recordings will be available in a couple of days on our Georgia State University Cyber website, as well as on our YouTube channel. So do look forward to that as well. When you exit the webinar at the end of our conversation with Professors Buckley and Yaprak today, there will be a short survey, 5 questions. Please respond to those. We read these, we look at them. We like to get your feedback and suggestions for future webinars. We have a huge group today, and I'm not surprised given the guests that we have today. I'm very happy to have them. Everyone in the webinar today, except the panelists, is muted, but we will be welcoming your questions and comments in the Q&A button. So at any point during our conversation here, please post them. I will try to monitor them, as well as Attila, and try to respond to them. And we generally keep these webinars to an hour or so, but sometimes the conversation is very rich, and we have other agendas that we'd like to cover. So we do go over it, and we'll let you know. But we'll leave about 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes for some questions and responses to your comments and questions. And if there are any handouts from this event, we will be sharing them with you as well. So with that, I'd like to welcome this wonderful group and start introducing my guests today. Professor Peter Buckley does not really require much of an introduction. He is a legend in our field of international business. I'm not going to read his bio. It's very extensive. It's obviously very impressive. We have here with us one of the most talented, one of the most multi-dimensional individuals in our discipline in higher education, I think. As I come to know Peter over the years, and as I visited Leeds University, where he's been teaching and contributing to for so many years, I got to know Peter a little bit better. I learned a lot of interesting things. I learned that he's a great fan of history. He's such an avid reader. I think he can compete with my wife in terms of how many books he reads on a daily basis. It's amazing. But I also come to learn Peter has a great fan of history and all kinds of history. And he's one of the most well-traveled individuals that I know. And, you know, in international business, we are all well-traveled, but Peter has been everywhere. And he's also a big fan of cricket, something that I have yet to learn. something about, but Peter promised me he's going to take me to a cricket game one of these days and give me a workshop on that. But Peter, thank you so much for making time and being with us here today with an informal conversation. I should say, Peter obviously is a pioneer in our field. His writings have shaped the development and discourse of international business thought. He's a prolific author, something like 50,000 Google citations, which is mind-boggling. And as I looked at, I was curious yesterday, Peter, I looked at the Google Scholar citations. Just this year, Peter has published in 2021, something like a dozen, almost 8, 10, 12 papers this year. I read a couple of them myself, more than a couple, obviously. But I would like to, for our guests today, our participants today, I'd like to highlight a couple, and maybe you'll talk about them in our conversation too. One is the role of history in IB, which was published in British Journal of Management. Something of interest to me, obviously, the evolution and development of the international business field. And the other more recent one, and we talked about this in our past conversations, the social purpose of the modern business corporation. Very timely piece. I recommend everybody to take a look at that. It's a fresh new perspective on the modern business corporation. Among other things, Peter has been an institution builder. I mentioned that he's been at Leeds University Business School for many years. He mentored a lot of junior faculty and doctoral students there, and also obviously contributed in a major way into developing Leeds University International Business Division into one of the best in the world. He also he's the founder of the Siebold Center there, Center for International Business. And through that particular center has put on many conferences, workshops, and so on. One of the things I really appreciate about Peter is that he's always been on the forefront of mega trends. He's one of those observers of the real world phenomena and gets going with research, scholarly, systematic research on those topics. So I was not surprised when Peter started researching and writing about emerging markets, about his interest in China, scholarly papers in China. One of them, obviously, you may remember, some of us will remember, won the Decade Award with his colleagues at Leeds University. And last so many years, the literature around the global factory has developed, has been embraced, and has helped many of us as well. So on a personal side, I think I mentioned a few personal things, but Peter is one of the most unselfish, giving, compassionate people. I don't think Peter has ever turned down an opportunity to us anyway, to talk to our students, to our faculty, to attend and maybe give a keynote. So he's done this so many times, and we are forever grateful. Peter is obviously a great family man. I've come to know his good wife, Anne, and his family. And I should say that all three men here today are grandpas, and Peter is a happy grandpa as well. I think he still devotes 2 days a week to babysitting that little girl, Peter. That comes with that's one of the responsibilities at our age. But Peter, thank you so much for being here with us. Really pleasure. With that, let me turn to my colleague, good friend, and co-moderator today, Professor Attila Yaprak. When I introduce sometimes Attila, I say that Attila and I grew up obviously in the same country in Turkey, and went to the same city almost, 2 different high schools, 30 miles apart from each other, never met each other. All those 5-6 years, Attila, when we were in middle school and high school, But then it took another 20 years, an AIB meeting in Las Vegas to meet you finally, where Attila was on a panel. He had just finished his dissertation, and his dissertation was one of the competitors in the best dissertation, AIB Best Dissertation Award. But it's been a lot of fun to get to know Attila over the years. I think people know Attila as a master teacher. He is obviously one of the most respected master teachers. Anybody who has met with him and been in a class, he knows his very unique skills of engaging his students at all levels, undergraduate, graduate, executive, and so on. But today, Attila, we take special pride in introducing you because you are one of us in the sense that you are a GSU-CIBER alum, PhD alum. Attila received his PhD from Georgia State University, Institute of International Business. When I was at Wisconsin, you were here at Georgia State, and those years were very good, obviously. 1970s, late 70s, when you were mentored by some of the best in the IB field. In fact, people like Jeff Arpan, Jose De La Torre, John Daniels, and Duane Kujawa, all four of these Jeff Arpan unfortunately passed away, but all four became AIB presidents, and they were all AIB fellows. And Attila, you had a big hand in the early years of the GIBS as well. GIBS was born at Georgia State, and the first editor was Ernie Ogram, Professor Ogram, and he was one of your mentors, and you had a hand in the early years of GIBS as well. Attila, of course, teaches at Wayne State University, in Urban University in Detroit. And Attila, I know you trained a lot of managers in the automotive industry because that's the industry around Detroit. But I never asked you whether you prefer Ford or General Motors cars, and how do you deal with students, who may see you driving the competitors' cars, but maybe you can tell us about that later on. Obviously, you mentored a lot of PhD students there. You served as an associate dean, I know, and you currently serve as a director of the PhD program. Attila taught at many, internationally, many universities as well. And I know he still teaches part-time, visiting professor at Sabancı University in Istanbul. Attila has published widely as well, and especially on behavioral, cultural aspects of international business. He's been a journal editor. And I guess most importantly, from an AIB perspective, Attila has been a long time AIB servant. Attila, I remember the years where you served as the AIB executive secretary, I think it's called, and now you are the chair of you are the AIB historian. So thank you so much for contributing to the Academy of International Business in so many meaningful ways as well. But with those introductions, let's just get on to our conversation that everybody's been waiting for, and welcome everybody to this session. I hope it will be fruitful and inspiring to you. I'm certainly looking forward to it. And if you joined us for the first time, please come back for future events. We run these webinars almost on a timely basis. Peter, thank you again. Maybe
thank you for the introduction.
Thank you. Maybe we can start with a personal question. I mean, I recall that you were trained, you had many interests when you started your university studies. History, I know, was one of them, but you were trained as an economist. What inspired you? What attracted you to the international business phenomena that you then dug deep and carried on some remarkable and seminal work?
Well, I never saw the jump as a great leap. And the reason I went into economics, and the reason that economics attracted me was as a practical subject. I was always interested in what economics can do for human welfare and what economics can do to help run economies, firms, and indeed the international economy well. So one of my initial interests, and it's remained an interest throughout my entire career, is development. And the economics of development were very much writ large in my, even as an undergraduate. I did international economics and development economics as my special subjects, and then fell into the interest on the multinational enterprise. And the multinational enterprise, to me, has always been interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's the most extreme form of the firm. So when you're looking at phenomenon, it's often interesting to look at the most extreme form of the firm. And secondly, it represents a massive potential clash between a really advanced, rich approach and investing in poor countries. So how do multinationals affect developing countries was a major interest. And then I did an MA in development economics, and then went on to look at the multinational and the investment potential of multinational, the good side, the bad side, the indifferent side, and the effects of the multinational enterprise. So to me, it was fairly seamless. It wasn't a matter of changing from one thing to another. It was a matter of applying economics, and that's the way I have always seen economics, and the way I hope it continues, well, at least partly, to develop.
It certainly served me well. I mean, we have common paths in the sense that I started studying economics first. I think it gave me some analytical skills, tools, and appreciated the questions that economics and economic development and international trade, in my case, were my specialization areas. So I benefited a lot from that. Attila, I welcome your comments and questions as well. Please go ahead. Yeah, your sound, Attila.
Yes, forgive me. Thank you. Peter, in various contexts in the past, the most recent being at the AIB conference, where we had a panel on the history of IB, you mentioned that, or noted that, the IB discipline emerged from a blending of at least 3 literature streams: international economics, industrial economics, and the theory of the firm. Can you elaborate on this a bit, please?
Yeah, I think the kind of phenomenon of the multinational enterprise and the phenomenon of foreign direct investment didn't fit economics. It didn't fit economics, and this is the major reason for the growth of international business. It didn't fit neatly into economics because international economics has always been at the forefront of all economics. A lot of the innovations in economics have come from international economics, and international economics contains some of the most fundamental principles of economics, which is comparative advantage and things like that. But when you tried to do a pure international economics view of foreign direct investment, it didn't work because people were looking at interest rates influencing flows of investment, and that clearly wasn't the case. So something else was going on. And in industrial economics, Bain and others were looking at issues of entry, and the fact that some firms seemed to be able to get a monopoly position whilst other firms couldn't manage to compete with them. Why was that? That was entry barriers. And then the third aspect of this was the theory of the firm. Why do we have firms? What is it about a firm that makes it such a powerful and interesting and long-lived institution? I mean, I've said recently that the 2 most important institutions in the world economy are multinational enterprises and nation states. So you've got all these 3 things coming together. You've got the theory of the firm, and that's where Mark Casson and I came in trying to explain what the firm was, and Corsi's simple but brilliant idea that the firm is there because of failures in the market and the firm replaces imperfect markets, and then you get internalization theory. So all these ideas have been going. I mean, international economics started at least 1664 with Thomas Munn and England's treasure by foreign trade. It was an established subject in the 1660s. So you had a real long tradition. But this phenomenon, and I think we're going to come back to the idea that international business is very much phenomenon driven. The phenomenon of foreign direct investment and then the phenomenon of the multinational enterprise didn't fit because of the differences within economics and the different approaches. So this provided a fantastic opportunity, which I think has been taken in many ways, for international business to produce theories, empirical work and observations on real world phenomena, which transcended kind of artificial boundaries within the subject of economics, as well as between economics and other subjects.
Very interesting. Peter, I'm teaching a doctoral seminar right now this semester with about 8 doctoral students. We're having a lot of fun reading some of your work and other work as well. We started our conversation with the discussion of Ronald Coase, many decades before really formal studies of firm were done by Syrton March in 1959, I think. The theory of the firm by let me go on and say that often when you look at the beginning of the formal study of international business, we think about Hymer, Stephen Hymer and his dissertation at MIT, which was of course advised by Kindleberger. Charles Kindleberger, who was a phenomenal economist himself. But that particular PhD, the international operations of national firms, a study of foreign direct investment for FDI, again, as you're saying, was the phenomenon that he was looking at and trying to explain why international production, why MNEs go abroad for international production. Often that's considered to be the mark or the milestone of the formal study of IB discipline. Was there IB? I mean, obviously there was IB before, international trade before. We didn't call it perhaps international business.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the number of times I've heard people say that international business began with Hymer in 1960. And in a sense, it did. I mean, Hymer represents a structural break. There's no question about it. Because of what we've just been saying about economics, economics couldn't really get together the arguments that Hymer pulled together, because he pulled together the 3 things I've been mentioning: international economics, industrial economics, and theory of the firm. So it was really a massive breakthrough. Now, Hymer, if you look at Hymer's thesis, one of the things that is incredibly striking is how few references he actually uses. It's not the kind of approach where we'll look at everything there is out there and put it together. It's very simple ideas. And Hymer, which are often very powerful, as you say, he was supervised by an outstanding international economist, Charles Kindleberger, who interestingly also have done a lot of work on international finance. And that's another area that needs to be brought in, the financing of foreign direct investment, the financing of the firm. Hymer managed to put these together in a really compelling way by ignoring massive amounts of literature that there was out there and concentrating on a couple of really important points. One is that foreign direct investment, the key is direct, the key is ownership. The key is that the firm controls and owns that foreign direct investment. And the second fact that he really majored on was that foreign direct investments, not just the capital flow, but it involves technology, management, all kinds of other flows. Now you put those two things together and you've got at least the beginning of a very, very powerful approach to multinationals and international business. Now you asked me a question of what else was out there, and really we could spend the next hour on what else was out there. I wrote an article in 2011, Journal of World Business, on pre-Heimer foreign direct investment. And if we take some of the highlights of that, we've talked about economics, which goes back to at least 1660. There was a fantastic literature, mainly between the wars, on cartels. Now, cartels, in my view, are coming back into fashion, and cartels are an alternative means of organizing international transactions. Heimer didn't mention that. We also had, before Heimer, lots of theories of imperialism. And ironically, since Heimer became a Marxist towards the end of his career, he didn't refer to the material on imperialism, which is really relevant because imperialism involves advanced countries interacting and, in fact, dominating less developed countries. And people were saying at the time that multinationals were a form of imperialism. So Hobson and people like that are highly relevant. Then there was there is out there a massive literature by people who we would call practitioners. Fred Rippey on Latin America is an example. These are fantastic. These are what we would now call international management books. They tell you how to enter markets, how to operate it from the experience of managers. And some of those are really fantastic. Phelps on South America, Rippey and so on. Then, in addition to all that, there was the literature, and Heimer was a Canadian, on the dominance of the US of Canadian industry. And this led to a very fruitful set of discussions about what happens when the economy of one country is very much dominated by another country. So you had all of those things going on. There was another literature where people were talking about the development effects of foreign direct investment. Fantastic studies of places like China. So so all of these came together. Now, it's the strength of Heimer, ironically, in that he ignored a lot of this and he concentrated on what Williamson calls the main case. He concentrated on the firm, he concentrated on foreign direct investment. And as such, he made a major breakthrough. There were other people around that time who were also researching foreign direct investment. And one of the most important, and there's no question that Heimer's thesis could not have been written without John Dunning's 1958 book on American investment in British industry. If you look at the examples that Heimer gives, it's all there. And of course, Dunning had this idea of firm-specific advantages, which Heimer picked up. Now, what Heimer did was to concentrate very much on the monopolistic side of multinationals. The argument that they were big firms, small countries, that they were dominant, that General Motors was more powerful than France. Not true, but people said things like that. So he concentrated on the monopoly power and the dominance of multinational firms. What he missed, in my view, and what Mark Casson and I brought out, was the innovation side of multinationals, the internalization of that innovation, and the internalization of all the aspects that you needed to build a multinational firm. So Heimer definitely was a structural break, and I, in a sense, don't blame people for saying international business started with Heimer, because the formal discipline, the systematization, theorizing did begin with Heimer. But let's not forget there are a lot of really good things out there that we could look at now, but Heimer largely, I think, chose not to look at. And one other point I should make with regard to the theory of the firm was 1959, 1 year before, Edith Penrose had published the theory of the growth of the firm. Again, an amazing analysis of the growth of firm, again, didn't fit with economics. Edith Penrose, not really recognized by economists, should have got the Nobel Prize, of course, in other circumstances. Brilliant piece of work, which, again, it didn't fit. Was it a theory of the firm? Was it industrial economics? What was it? People didn't really appreciate how powerful that work was. And of course, a lot of people now attribute the whole growth of strategic management to Edith Penrose's work. So the sort of period from the late 50s, early 60s, really very, very productive in terms of launching centrally international business subjects.
Very good point. And I think, Peter, this is a very good teaching moment for young scholars in our audience, that advancement of science and knowledge takes place in these building blocks. And every contributor certainly leaves something for the next one. And sometimes we look back and we appreciate and we digest, but sometimes we overlook. I very much agree with you that Edith Penrose's 1959 book was a remarkable contribution, as she was really the first one to talk about the manager in a formal way, the enterprise and manager, she called it, and risk-taking attitudes, and started opening this black box for us that the IO people or economists in general had not really ventured into, because their focus was industry and nation as a whole. And she really was one of the most important contributors. So I'm wondering whether Stephen Heimer in 1960, when he was writing and finished his dissertation, read and got inspired by the book that was published the year before by Edith Penrose.
Heimer had a very interesting career trajectory, because of course the 60 book was itself not recognized, wasn't published till 76. I remember at Reading, John Dunning had a copy of Heimer's thesis, a photocopy of it, and it passed around the department and we all wrote notes on it and so on. And it wasn't until 76 that was published. That was a bit of a shameful thing, really. But Heimer then wrote more things on multinationals, and then moved over to the Marxist kind of critique of development and management. So I'm not sure he would really have taken on board Edith Penrose's work. Mm-hmm. But a little anecdote about that is the very first time I met Edith Penrose was at INSEAD. And I went for dinner with her and a couple of other colleagues. And the moment I sat down at dinner, Edith said to me, "How do you justify first sentence of chapter 2 of your book?" That was the first thing she ever said to me. And the first sentence of chapter 2 of The Future of the Multinational Enterprise says, "There is no established theory of the multinational enterprise." And of course, we spent the whole of that dinner and probably the whole of the rest of the time that I ever knew her arguing about whether a multinational enterprise needed any special theory. Because if you look at Penrose's book and Penrose's writing, and I've written several things on what Penrose wrote, her view is that international is just another barrier. It's not anything desperately significant. In fact, she makes the point at one point that it's often easier to manage overseas subsidiaries than it is to manage domestic ones. So she did have a different approach, and it is. I think when we're talking about we're talking about the heritage of international business thinking, it really is worth students moving away from the last 2 or 3 issues of Gibbs and having a look at some of these classic works, because as you say, I mean, now we think you mentioned the role of the manager in the firm, absolutely critical problem for international business. You know, we have these different levels. We have the manager, the firm, the industry, the nation, the globe, and we have to move across these different levels. That's one of the beauties of international business and one of the reasons that it's such a difficult subject to cope with. What is the role of the manager within the firm? And of course, Edith Penrose gave her name to the Penrose effect. The fact that when you expand your firm, you need to expand the management capacity, and that is often a constraint on growth. So, you know, looking back at some of these ideas, these are very fundamental. You use the term building blocks, which is still incredibly relevant.
Thank you, Peter, for those insights. I mean, you mentioned already Dunning, and we can add, you know, Raymond Verman, 1960s at Harvard Kennedy School rather than the business school, actually, and his disciples who followed them, who looked at the M&E activities, foreign direct investment again, and then obviously we have Rugman and Thies and others. So what has been their contribution? Obviously, they came after Edith Penrose, they came after Stephen Heimer, Kindleberger.
Very, very important. I think Vernon, the product cycle and the work that came from that were absolutely fundamental, because I was kind of criticizing Heimer for not looking at innovation. Vernon was all about innovation. The product cycle was all about innovation. And the beauty of that was the dynamics of it. It wasn't just you make an invention and then you move on. It was looking at the whole impact of that invention, initially at industry level. Again, we have this levels problem. Industry level, firm level, how do these interact, who are the firms, and so on. So the product cycle was an incredibly profound step forward in bringing dynamics into international business. And if I can be forgiven another anecdote, I was told by one of Raymond Vernon's outstanding students, Monty Graham, who sadly passed away at a very young age. Monty Graham said that when The Future of the Multinational Enterprise came out, Vernon's reaction was, why didn't we think of that? And you know, these things, Heimer's approach and the monopoly, Vernon's approach and innovation, say a great deal about the multinational enterprise. You know, one of my lines is multinational enterprises are both part of the problem and part of the solution. And to most things, that's absolutely true. And the innovation side, of course, links in very profoundly with the monopolistic side, because we reward innovation by giving people a monopoly, a patent. And that's the reward people get for innovation. So the two things are interwoven, and that's what makes multinationals, foreign direct investment, and all the rest of it a continually fascinating subject. Sure
is, at different periods with different forces, period of disruption, certainly, and the role of emerging markets in FDI as well. We'll talk about those two. Attila, let me give you a chance to also ask a question.
Sure. And first, I apologize. We have a rainstorm going on here, and I lost my internet connection for a moment. But let me ask you this, Peter. We've come a long way in IB. How would you describe our successes? What would you say our successes have been in the last, 5-6 decades? What have we done well up to this point? So if you could elaborate on those, please.
I think if you look back that 5 decades, as you say, it's incredible, really. But you look back to Heimer. First of all, explaining foreign direct investment flows. The mere conceiving of what foreign investment is and looking at the flows, either explained at the level of the firm by monopolistic protection, firm-specific advantages, internalization, however you want to do it, or at national level by outflows and inflows from various countries. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the conception and the modeling and the growth and looking at multinational firms as an institution, moving away from foreign direct investment as a flow to the institution that controls it and determines where foreign investment goes, how much, where, and all the rest of it. And the third thing is moving away from the idea of stepwise internationalization, you know, kind of Uppsala approach, very interesting approach as you're internationalizing, to managing global firms, globalization, and to different forms of doing things, alliances and the alternatives to the multinational enterprise. All of those things, I think, were very early and very important, and are still continuing today, because in foreign direct investment, you know, entry strategy, you know, how you enter, how you manage, how you change things, all remain very important. So I think all of those things are really well understood now, to the point that they look a bit routine, and that's what science should do. They should move from something that looks very strange to making it look routine, and we explain it and we understand it, and then we move on.
If I might follow up on that, Peter, let's say that we have moved from internationalization to globalization. First, if you could elaborate on that a little bit, but the question is, what do you see in the post-globalization period? Well, so it's a two-part question.
Yeah, the idea of internationalization, looking at a firm moving forward, to looking at the whole system and seeing the system as a global system, whereby we have a mix of multinational firms, small firms, national firms, and so on. So seeing the global system as a whole and being able to explain that by, in my terms, by internalization theory and location theory would be the key things. But also the other element, I think, that comes in with globalization are issues of governance. Who owns activities? Who controls activities? To what end do they do it? Tamer alluded earlier to this idea of the purpose of the company. What is the purpose? Why are companies doing it? Is it just about profit, or are there other things going on? So that's, I think, looking at the global system. Now, when we look at the global system, the next question you ask is, well, what happens to that system? And what happens to that system at the moment is it's under threat. It's under the system of it never really occurred, but the idea that we have a global system is now being fractured. You know, we have the China versus America, which team are you in, and the barriers between that. We have the so-called splinter net, where the basis of doing business on a single integrated internet is now being cut up. We have anti-globalization policies, anti-globalization rhetoric. So the whole thing is being questioned again. That is what happens. You know, a system arises and then it's questioned, and people throw negatives at it and so on. And I think, again, you know, this makes international business more important rather than less important. At the theoretical level, you can go right back to the conflict between Adam Smith, who was in favor of free trade and an open economy, and Frederick List, who wanted national innovation and national economy. And the Chinese seem to be more influenced by List than they are by Smith. They want a national system of innovation that is owned. That's a bit like this dual circulation idea that's come about. So international business remains, you know, incredibly important, because the nation state, international, the words are in there. The nation state is an absolutely crucial player, and at the moment is flexing its muscles to an extent that perhaps we haven't seen for a while. And what is really important again is this multi-level and interdisciplinary way of thinking about this, that there are different levels. There's the firm, the industry, the nation, and the international economy, and the manager below that. So there's all these different levels interacting, and you need to have a very wide, cast your net very wide to get hold of some of these effects.
Thank you. Tamer, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter. As I'm thinking, Peter, you know, you obviously your seminal works and those with Kassan and others were the early contributions to the theoretical development of the field, which got us the reputation, the recognition in the business school. So we are at the table now in business school as an independent group. So you also said that IB is phenomenon driven, and we've seen some of that. So as we saw the born global phenomenon, for example, there's been theoretical development around that. As we saw international entrepreneurship, there's been theoretical development around that. As we saw the rise of emerging markets and middle classes, there's been theoretical development around that. Are you satisfied with the theoretical development of the field of international business? Are these good contributions? Do you see more along these lines, more theoretical frameworks beyond the, you know, theory of internalization?
You can never be satisfied with theoretical positions, because there's always, you know, all knowledge is provisional. And all theories are provisional. And the idea of a theory is you attempt to refute it. And I think this was one of the really interesting things about the rise of emerging country multinationals. That here you had theories that purported to explain multinationals, but were actually based on advanced country, exclusively on advanced countries. Then suddenly the phenomenon, here we have the phenomenon-driven thing, with a phenomenon of emerging markets, multinationals comes around, and the result is some people say, well, we need a new theory. And other people like me said, no, let's try the existing theory. And we tried the existing theory, we tested it, and it was really quite exciting to do this, because there's always the possibility that emerging market multinationals would not fit the theory in various ways. And how would that affect things? And in some ways, they actually don't fit. But in our GIBS article in 2007 that got the Decade Award, we're looking at China, we found that a lot of the factors, the theoretical factors, still worked. There were some that were incorrect, there's some that didn't work. And so we perhaps need a special theory within the general theory to look at emerging market multinationals. So you've got to constantly evolve, and you've got to, I think it's healthy that there are different approaches, and it's healthy that people have taken different phenomena and asked the question, how do we explain these phenomena? You mentioned some there, like rise of the middle class, like international entrepreneurship. We can think of family firms internationalizing. Are they the same? Are they different? In what ways are they? This is entirely healthy. And it would be a very sad day when we ignored the real world, when we didn't look up phenomena. There are new phenomena all the time. A lot of the things we've just talked about 5 years ago would not be on the agenda. Anti-globalization probably wouldn't be. Family firms come into prominence. Now, part of this is phenomenon-driven, and part of it is because we have a vibrant academic community where people have got their antenna out looking for something new, or looking for things that don't fit, or explanations that don't work. That's entirely healthy, and I think that's been one of the really positive things about the way international business has developed. It's not tried to say, this is the answer, go away if you don't agree with it. What it's tried to say is, here are some answers Do you think they fit? Are you happy with them? Do they, so, you know, we've got a lot of stuff now about context, the role of context. Well, how far does a theory fit a context? Where are the boundaries of theory? You know, where can we push the idea? We should be trying to push the theory to see if it can cope with these things. And emerging market multinationals are probably the best example of that, but there's lots more.
Excellent.
We talked about context. In the new environment, Peter, what do you see as contextual phenomena or phenomena in context? For example, turbulence, uncertainty, and so on, that will help shape future thinking in international business, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the, you know, I've been rather taken perhaps too much with this idea of VUCA, you know, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which is an attempt to try and get at some of the complexity that firms have to deal with. So the current environment, it's quite difficult to work out what, we always think the current environment's very different from what it was in the past, but a lot of these challenges have occurred before. You know, the world economy was very much integrated around trade and investment flows before World War I. And then that absolutely shattered it, and we built it again. And then World War II was another shock. So the coping with shock and coping with extreme forms of risk, I think, is something that perhaps we should pay extra attention to. And political risk is an important element of that, but it's not the only kind of risk, as we know from the pandemic. I mean, who would have expected that to hit the way that it has done? So businesses have to cope with extreme forms of uncertainty. And I think this has caused a lot of rethinking of things like planning, you know, using scenario planning and trying to have more open forms of planning, building in redundancies and alternatives and competition in value chains and so on. So I think the business environment is extremely challenging, and it's very interesting time to be observing this and talking, you know, listening to the way that people have tried to restructure their value chains under this extreme types of pressure. It does turn out that there's quite a bit of resilience built in. I mean, the kind of global factory approach that I use suggests that you should have alternative means of doing things, never build in monopoly. All these kind of rules become more important, I think, in situations of extreme VUCA, if we could put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Peter. If we want to be a little bit self-critical, Peter, and look at the IB scholarship a little bit and ask ourselves, would you be satisfied? What is it that we're doing really well, and where do you see opportunities to do better as IB scholars?
Well, just from the conversation that we were having there, I think there are kind of three areas that I can think of that are at the forefront that we're doing really well in. One is global value chains. Now, you could argue that the straight international business approach concentrated too much on the firm and not enough on value chains, networks, and so on. That is being put right. There's a lot of work, great work being done on value chains and restructuring value chains and so on. Second thing I've already mentioned, I think we've done a really good job of looking at emerging country multinationals. I think this is a really interesting seedbed for testing all the different approaches that we've got. And I think the third thing is that the general way that multinationals have to adjust to the extra demands of what we might call civil society on them. In other words, corporate social responsibility, sustainability, inclusion, diversity. These are things that that multinationals have to respond to. And multinationals, as usual, are at the sharp end of this. Because if you're operating in a country where women don't have full rights, but you're trying to say you're an ethical company, how do you cope with that? How do you cope with issues of dealing with people who have different values? These are everyday issues within a multinational enterprise. So these are all, and I think if you ask me to be a bit critical, I think we still, perhaps I should say because I don't want to criticize everybody, have difficulty integrating culture and cultural difference. It's a really hard job. As you know, I've done a lot of qualitative work and work on culture, and it's really hard to integrate that with the more kind of objective, positivist approach that comes from economics. So these are really fascinating things, and you can have great conversations with people across the other side of the divide, as long as we keep a very open mind. I mean, what scares me is the closing of the mind, and anybody who doesn't agree with me is not only wrong but evil, and that is just that'll destroy the whole thing. So we have to keep an open mind. We have to agree to disagree, and we have to find ways of disagreeing. I've had a paper rejected because it was deemed that I was too critical of somebody, a very famous person who could certainly stand up for themselves. And we have to take that. I mean, I've had to take that, and I think people have to take it. I think you're wrong. I disagree with you. Maybe you're not 100% right. Let's put it that way. Yeah, I think we've got. We live in a really interesting times, as the Chinese curse says, and we really have to work in as open-minded a way as we can, and across boundaries as far as we can, in terms of subject and approach and all the rest of it. That's where international business has had its strength in the past, and that would be where I would hope it would continue to have its strength. If there's a threat, that is the threat. That's
an excellent point. I think it's such unusual times. You mentioned VUCA. Certainly the depression, the recession that follows, the great pandemic, health pandemic, and many other developments that were there before. For example, inequality of income and opportunity, and trade tensions among countries that were there, demographic changes, certainly, and certainly most recently the refugees. Somebody said yesterday we may have as many as 1 billion political refugees around the world, and that's going to create a lot of discomfort among the societies that are receiving them. We see this already in the US and many other countries as well. So it's certainly interesting times, as the Chinese have said. So how do you see then opportunity for IB researchers to pick up on these fundamental mega trends and develop systematic agendas and start researching? What kind of advice would you give to the young people?
Well, I think that's, you've said it there. I think there are two things I would say. The first thing is there are some big questions, and big questions arise from academic work, they arise from conundrums, they arise from unexplained things, they arise from new phenomena that are not really covered, like the emerging markets case that I keep coming back to. So there are big questions, but rather more than that, there are what we might call grand challenges. And the grand challenges are the kind of things that you've been alluding to. Climate change, biggest one of all possibly, the pandemic, migration, the one that I started with and I'm always having in the back of my mind, which is poverty and you know, the poorest of the poor. So there are lots of these grand challenges, and I think international business is in a very strong position to start tackling these, because we have, I think this conversation, I hope, has alluded to some of the things that we have that are real strengths: the interdisciplinary approach, the multi-level approach, the phenomenon-driven approach, and the fact that we bring in not just the firm, but the nation state, the political side, civil society. We bring all these things in as explanatory variables. So I think we're in a really strong position. And of course, the other thing that is very, I think is very strong, is our strong links in international business with international institutions, such as UNCTAD, UNIDO, things like that, who are right at the forefront of these grand challenges. So I think strengthening those ties and looking at those issues and being aware of grand challenges is the way forward. And that is much more of a challenge than trying to add an extra variable to an equation or, you know, criticizing last week's GSU-CIBER. I think we have to look bigger and wider. Not everybody, but as a community, we have to do that. And I several times in various pieces, I've said international business is at its best when it's a collective enterprise. And I firmly believe that. It's not one individual. It's groups and it's institutions like AIB and EBA and other institutions taking on some of these issues.
And I think we're fortunate because it's also an applied discipline.
Yeah.
I think we get a lot of our inspiration from the real world. One of our, in the interest of time, we'll turn to some of the comments and questions, Attila, from the participants as well. Stephanie makes a good comment here. We have not talked about digitalization and growth of the digital economy. She's saying it's well known that digitalization is shaping firms' boundaries. Obviously, actually, the firm is becoming boundaryless in a sense to a great extent. So this kind of growth of e-platforms, electronic platforms, and digital enterprises, some of them are well known. They've become very, very successful. They become unicorns. Many of them don't succeed, but quite a few of them do. They may not become an all unicorn, but there's a lot of obviously e-commerce today, and therefore firms pursuing digital internationalization.
Yeah.
So do you see that as an
yeah? I regret that I hadn't mentioned. It's one of those things I wish I'd mentioned, because I mean this works at all kinds of levels, as you say, for the smaller firms being able to internationalize digitally, you know, digital first companies is really important. At the other end of the spectrum, you know, the internalization of the platform is really crucial. You control the platform, and everybody else is a supplicant in various ways trying to get their apps onto your platform. And this is true not only in traditional digital industries, but in things like the car industry, where we're going to see a massive shakeup through the platform being made available at scale, and lots of people being able to customize that platform to their own needs. So we could have a car, you know, going around with a platform with the top part designed by Gucci or Armani or somebody. So you could, you know, digitalization breaks down lots of these boundaries, and that's absolutely right. I mean, it is something that I regret I haven't mentioned, because it's so important. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yes. Another good colleague, Alex Rialp from Barcelona, makes a comment. What do you think are or will be the best skills, tools, knowledge sources, attitudes, and orientations that will be highly contributing to a scholar in IB in the next decade or so. I mean, what kind of skills do we expect young scholars? Obviously, it's going to be a mix of methodological skills as well as deep knowledge.
Yeah, needless to say, methodological skills are really important, and the training on that. But I think also an awareness of outside phenomenon and the ability to link theory with practice. Theory, in my view, is not something that's floating around. Theory is something that actually works. You know, my mantra is Kurt Lewin's phrase, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And I think open-mindedness, decision-making skills, and ability to work with other people who have different skills, because no one person is able to deal with a lot of the issues we've got. So there are kind of some eternal verities in academic work, and open-mindedness, ability to think outside the box, ability to challenge your own preconceptions. These are very, very important skills, and they're not easy to foster, but we have to foster them, and we have to challenge people to be able to think outside the box. Is a terrible phrase, but it's the best I can do at this point.
Mm-hmm. We have a great following and people from all over the world. We have one in particular from New Zealand. I think Matt Raskovich in New Zealand is asking, IB seems to be entering an era of identity politics. How does one begin to incorporate the role of social identity in IB thinking beyond the individual level of analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a little bit of this. It's interesting stuff. I mean, I've done a little bit of this because we looked at virtual teams. This was a project where we looked at virtual teams and the role of identity in virtual teams. And I'm also doing some work on the role of emotion in decision. You know, we tend to think of decisions being entirely, well, I tend to think of decisions being made entirely rationally and explain things by rational decision making. But of course, you have to bear in mind that we're human beings. We have issues of identity, we have issues of emotion. And I think that's a challenge. I think we have to, again, like the point I was making about culture, we have to find ways of bringing this perspective in. And not letting it kind of dominate everything. Not everything is identity, not everything is emotion, but it is there, and they're important. And at certain points, these become really important issues. When are they? How do they come about? How do we look at this? What is their role in management decision making? Fantastic questions. Not all. Nobody ever said I would have all the answers, but I certainly think these are interesting questions.
Well, you're wonderful. You're doing great, Peter, and we expected that. One of our colleagues, Arif Zaman from UK, is talking about the importance and significance of international business history, which obviously you have contributed a lot. You have a deep interest, and you always remind us its importance. And unfortunately, I see among young people a tendency to look back when they do their literature research, 10 years, maybe 20 years, and then they say anything written before that may not be valid. But to some extent, it may not be relevant or obsolete, but obviously there's a lot to learn from history.
Well, I think, I like the Mark Twain comment that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And, you know, a lot of the things that rhyme are coming back. I mean, look at the national innovation system that List wrote about. Maybe we could have written that off, but then China comes along. Think about, you know, cartels. Think about how all that literature on cartels that we could have forgotten about. But cartels could become really important. They may be a way of doing business in a fractured world economy that multinationals and integrating multinational can't achieve. If you look at the final few pages of The Future of the Multinational Enterprise, which Mark and I wrote in 1976, we predict the breakup of the multinational, that licensing, as we then called it, will become increasingly important. Think about outsourcing, think about the way technology is used across a network and not within a multinational firm. So those who do forget history, they may not be condemned to relive it, but they're losing a lot. And international business history is very rich, as we were saying earlier when I was talking about Heimer and how much he did not take on board. He succeeded because he focused on one thing. But the cost of that was that a lot of literature that we could have perhaps paid more attention to was lost. And some of it is now being rediscovered. So, and then you've got the classic works that, you know, I can't imagine teaching anything about how firms grow without ever mentioning Penrose. You know, because there's so much in there. Okay, yes, of course the context is different. You've got digitalization, you've got identity politics, you've got all these things. But what some of the eternal truths in there, that you need to expand your management team in ways that reflect the way the company is developing, still true today, even truer today, probably, but given that we now have to have, you know, that firms have to pay attention to diversity and inclusion. What does that tell you about what kind of management team you've got? Penrose effect.
Yes. I mean, so you mentioned supply chains. Federica Sacco, I believe she's from Pavia, Italy, talks about the effect of the pandemic on supply chains, and we've seen the disruptions all over the world. What extent the pandemic will have prolonged, enduring effects in terms of reshoring, regionalization of supply chains? Do you see that to be a big?
I think we, you know, again, short run, then there's disruption. The company's concerned about survival, getting alternative sources at whatever cost, and making sure that it fulfills its orders and doesn't go bankrupt. In the medium term, it can then start to look more at how do we configure our value chains? What are the opportunities for us? Where have we got the biggest problems and bottlenecks? How do we get around it? And then in the long term, you can really start thinking about how, with a blank sheet of paper almost in the long run, you can reconfigure your value chains. Now, these things are going on in different stages in different industries at different times, so it looks complex. But basically, companies are reappraising their value chains the whole time, instantaneously almost as we speak, and with, you know, with the new methods of managing value chains, artificial intelligence, blockchain, all these kind of things, we should expect changes. We should expect the world economy to look different, and it will.
Thank you so much, Peter. Attila, I'll give you a chance to make maybe some final comments or ask a final question. But Peter, before we leave you, I do want you to maybe comment on your most recent article, The Social Purpose of the Modern Business Corporation, because I think that's so close to my heart, and I think it should be to many of us. And you've done a lot of thinking on that topic and developed that chapter article.
Yeah,
I would like to say something about that as well.
Well, yeah, I think this originally came about from the British Academy major project on the future of the corporation, and I wanted to look at the ways in which not just social responsibility, but the whole kind of impact of civil society on the way firms were run would work out. We have the move from purely shareholders to stakeholders. We have new demands. We have issues that arise from managing that and coping with that and collecting the information and all the challenges that companies face there. But one of the other things we've got is now a kind of issue about, is there a trade-off between being the most profitable you can be and being the most kind of socially acceptable we can be, given that there's pressure also for, you know, ESG, environmental, social and governance issues. I think there are some really profound questions facing managers of firms at all levels, not just multinational firms. So I was kind of exploring you know, where that would go. And the way I kind of rationalized it at the end of it is to think that, yes, these may be constraints, but they're also massive opportunities. And the idea that companies are constrained by regulations, rules, and so on is true. The reverse side of that is this gives them fantastic opportunities if they can get it right. And so that was, it was a kind of story that led me to think that the first look at this is that companies are very constrained. They're going to have a lot of pressure on them, regulators and so on. But when you look at it carefully, when you think of the kind of ethical consumer and the other kind of opportunities there are massive opportunities for companies if they comprehend the environment that they're facing and they're flexible enough to take it. I mean, I was asked to talk in Hong Kong. I was standing here, but it was in Hong Kong. I was asked, did I have any hope, given this was at the depth of the pandemic? I said the hope that I can, right out of the blue, the hope that I can offer you is two things: flexibility and innovation. And if companies have flexibility, they're flexible enough and they're innovative enough, and those two things are fantastic mantras for academics as well. Let's be flexible, let's be innovative.
Well said, well said. Attila, I will give you the last word.
I just want to say thank you, Peter, for this wonderful conversation with us. I have always found throughout the years or the decades in which I've known you, conversations with you have always been very inspiring and, you know, very thought-provoking. And I hope that especially our younger colleagues will find this conversation and others that they will have with you in the future as inspiring as I have found them in the past. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, and of course, I'm sure our participants also enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and an honor for me to be on this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you as well, Attila. Peter, you have a lot of praise expressed to you through the chat and Q&A. So thank you so much. We really appreciated this conversation. We look forward to doing more with you. We will stay on, the panelists, all three of us will stay on for the next 15 minutes or so. We'll turn off our audio and video and respond to some of the questions as best as we can that we could not get to during the limited time. But I do appreciate everybody who joined us from around the world today. For some of them, it was late at night, maybe even very, very early in the morning.
Early in the morning.
And definitely, we appreciate it. We built over this year-and-a-half period a huge international community of over 3,000 IB educators around the world. And we've been able to deliver many, many insights, and we really appreciate Peter joining us today. So thank you so much. The three of us will stay on, but audio, video will be turned off. We'll respond to some of the questions and comments. Thank you again. Take care.
Thank you.